Welcome back to the Thinking Minds podcast. My name's Alex, I'm a consultant psychiatrist. If you've been interested in psychology for long or studied it at any depth, it's likely that at some point you've heard of Carl Jung. Yet, despite being one of the most influential figures in 20th century psychology, at the time he was around, he was actually largely ostracized by the psychological community. Despite that ostracization, many people are attracted to the works of Carl Jung, his different theories about life and psychological development, and also the way that he combines psychology with spirituality. With me to discuss Carl Jung and his work today is MJDorian. MJDorian is an artist, educator, podcast creator, and award-winning composer. In 2018, he launched his podcast, The Creative Codex, in which he explores the mysteries of creative genius through narrative, sound design, and original music, and that includes the creative genius of Carl Jung. Today we discuss a bit about who Jung was, the major theories that Jung contributed to psychology, why Jung had a falling out with Freud, and the main differences between Jungian psychology and Freudian psychology, the Jungian interpretation of dreams, some of Jung's more interesting or influential books, particularly some of his more mysterious works he completed towards the end of his life, like the infamous Red Book, what Jung would have thought of the modern world, Jung's apocalyptic visions, and much more. We also discuss how Jung influenced MJ's creative process and MJ's thoughts on pursuing a career in the arts. This is the Thinking Minds podcast, a podcast all about psychology, psychotherapy, psychiatry, and related topics. If you like it, there are a few ways you can support it. You can share it with a friend, give us a rating, follow or subscribe on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen, which really helps new people to find us. Or if you want to support us further, you can check out the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description. In addition, if psychotherapy is something you've not just heard about, but maybe you want to try out for yourself, whether it's just to learn a bit more about yourself or to deal with a specific problem you might be having in your personal life, I'm now offering one-on-one private psychotherapy sessions, both in person in the South London area and online. So if that's something you're interested in, you can email me at alexcurmitherapy@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and now here's today's conversation with MJDorian. MJDorian, thanks for coming on the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, Alex. Thank you so much for inviting me. Looking forward to our conversation.
What do you wish more people would understand about Carl Jung?
I mean, there's a lot there to dig into, but I would say that the way I view him in the context of the 20th century and psychology as a whole, two things I would first say about him are that he was this very unique figure in that he basically became like the Nikola Tesla of psychology. The Nikola Tesla, obviously originally of electrical engineering, he reinvented the field, he turned it upside down, and he brought something new and valuable to our lives, or in technology, which is alternating current. Dr. Carl Jung did something similar, because without him, that track of Freud's psychology would have been very much the dominant one, even though in some circles it still is. But Carl Jung came along, and we could talk about the history there between those two figures, but he presented something so fresh and different that very much runs on a parallel track to modern psychology. And I would see him as this figure that's the Nikola Tesla of psychology. And then additionally, I would say one thing that even people who are already interested in Jung's ideas and his theories tend to overlook is that he himself was also one of these creative genius figures. So coincidentally, he was just involved in the field of psychology. He could have just as easily went into a creative field, I believe. And when you look at books like The Art of C.G. Jung and his personal life, you see that he was constantly engaged by creative work. And I believe it's because of those creative inclinations that he was able to intuit these facets of the mind that he did. So that's where I would start with that.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about Freud and Jung, because Freud also was a revolutionary, for his time. he was the one. He didn't necessarily come up with the idea of the unconscious, but he did popularize it. And in many, at the time, he was seen as extremely radical. And it's also, I always find it so interesting to see how much hate there is towards Freud. And for my money, whenever you see a lot of hate and vitriol, that possibly that person may have been onto something when it stirs up a lot of negative emotion. What do you think are the key differences between Freudian psychology and Jungian psychology?
Right. It's helpful to just note their history there, because honestly, I think that interplay that was happening in the early 1900s in the field of psychology between Freud and Jung, it's one of the greatest stories of psychology in general. And so we can maybe just touch on that a moment. So Freud comes along, and as you said, he presents this pivotal theory of the unconscious and his interpretation of it, psychopathology and complexes and such. And then Jung is also in training to be a psychologist, and he's taken under the wing of Freud, and he has clinical work. He early on works in a hospital with schizophrenics and such, and then he has his own private practice. And very much in the field and among his colleagues, he's seen as the heir apparent to Freud, that he's going to carry the torch after Freud has to, put down his working tools and such. But what ends up happening around 1910s is that Jung starts to have this split from Freud. They tend to have more arguments in their personal interactions, and there starts to be these distinctions that Jung can no longer parse with, and he can no longer set aside. For one, he sees that Freud tends to have this very pessimistic view of human nature, in that he tends to associate all of an adult's complexes with childhood traumas and sexuality and these kinds of things, and he refuses to acknowledge that there can be these other influences, for neuroses. He also, in Jung's view, doesn't consider the unconscious going deep enough, that he kind of just takes the bar and stops it at the level of the personal unconscious. On the other hand, to Jung was very fascinated early on by religion, by spirituality, by dreams. So was Freud. But in Jung's view, there's deeper layers there to uncover, and these deeper layers influence us in daily life, in our life choices. And Freud seemed to refuse to acknowledge those or even consider, their validity. And finally, he had a certain disregard for a human's need for some kind of spiritual engagement. He tended to see religion as fantasy fulfillment, and on the other hand, Jung thought that man's search for meaning and our engagement with spiritual practices was essential to human nature. So those inform basically how the two tend to branch off from that point on, I think.
Why do you think Freud was so reluctant to change his thinking, or to think that maybe Carl Jung had some good points? Do you think that this is a very difficult question to answer, so I'm not necessarily expecting you to answer it, but do you think he just thought that Jung was frankly incorrect? Or do you think, based on the history, that maybe Freud's ego was threatened? He was, this giant in psychology at the time, and maybe he was feeling a bit undermined by his star disciple.
Right. I mean, it's a topic that I'm sure a number of books have explored, because it presents a very loaded territory of these, obviously, these two early juggernauts of psychology and how they clashed. From my understanding, sure, Freud had his own issues, his own ego involved in his work, and at that point, because he was so established, the idea of someone like Jung being able to present this alternate view was insulting, in a sense, because there was nobody else presenting an alternate view to Freud at the time. And so, Freud probably saw Jung in a sense of like a surrogate son, and someone that, would really be able to carry on his legacy. and for him to then say, well, you have these major flaws here, I think was partially insulting. And I think it was personal by that point, because they did split and then they didn't talk to each other for a number of years. So it was clearly more than just this kind of amicable professional split. There was a lot of personal emotions involved and intense kind of heated arguments.
Yeah, it's always interesting when psychiatrists show their own neuroses, isn't it? How, how did you become interested in Jung? You've done a whole series on Jung in your podcast, Creative Codex, which I certainly recommend. Where did you come across Jung, and why did he spark your interest?
Right. So I've done a number of series on Jung in my podcast, which started as a personal fascination that I've had for a very long time. And because of the very positive response to my initial series, which was only about the Red Book, I've delved further into other material of his, like the Seven Sermons to the Dead and his obsession with alchemy, each giving a few episodes per series. But early on, I would say the thing that attracted me to Jung and Jung's theories is that myself as an artist, as a creative person, and as somebody interested in spiritual practices, Jung presents a framework in which to understand those human traits. The inclination to pull up a canvas and paint something, the confusion of waking up from a dream that seemed incredibly profound, yet completely mysterious and foreign to you, and of course the inclination to want to engage with myth and want to have a spiritual practice and pursue these kinds of things. Jung presents a framework in which that makes sense and in which it encourages you to continue those things, because even setting aside metaphysical instances or opinions, he presents these ideas as valuable to your psychology in general, valuable to your mental health. And so I think that's what initially attracted me.
So, and it's interesting because Jung came, of course, from the medical world. So he was a doctor, psychiatrist, then psychotherapist, and then particularly later in his life, he starts to build these bridges between psychology and spirituality, but also creativity, which obviously means you can include a lot more people. People of various dispositions can now become attracted to your work because you're creating connections between these disciplines, which are seemingly disparate, but actually might be more connected than they think. And of course, Jung paid a price for this, because this is part of the reason for the split from Freud. This is part of the reason for the ostracization from the rest of the psychological community. His almost willingness to dive into things in a quite a integrative, holistic manner. I'd like to talk about dreams a bit. How, from a Jungian standpoint, how should we approach thinking about our dreams?
Yeah, it's a completely fascinating topic. Well, I think as we're kind of laying the groundwork for this conversation, it would be also valuable to just quickly present Jung's model of the psyche, because these theories and things that we'll discuss very much will make more sense in the context of a rough idea of his model as it differs from other psychologists. So primarily we can say there's four facets that are most notable in Jung's view of the psyche, and they would be the ego, the personal unconscious, the collective unconscious, and then the self with the capital S. So loosely defined, the ego would be easy to remember in the sense of its Latin definition, which simply is I. It's the pronoun I. Anything that refers to itself in your mind as I is part of your conscious mind, and that's your ego. And this is stripping any, positive or negative connotations that we might have in, our colloquial use of the word ego. It's just anything that refers to itself as I. And that includes the mask of our persona that we wear in, social situations and such. Then there's the personal unconscious, which is anything that for whatever reason we've pushed back into our unconscious, whether it be memories, personal complexes, our motivations, and these kinds of things. that's unique to each individual. Then Jung presents this idea that there's also the collective unconscious, which is in a sense more ancient than the other two. And if we imagine kind of builds, one builds on the other. And so the collective unconscious, we could say most notably contains the archetypes, which Jung described as images and these potentialities that bubble forth in our human experiences, in our stories, in our dreams, and in our life. Then the self with the capital S, the easiest way to imagine that is it's the circle within whose bounds all those other facets exist. So the self is kind of everything combined, and oddly enough, the self also has its own direction that it wants to, as a conductor of all those things that are going on, direct that story. And we can talk about any of those, of course, but just remembering that that's kind of the model we're working within is helpful.
Mm-hmm. And Jung also described not only a structure of the psyche, but like a process that people go through across their lives, a process of individuation. Can you walk us through a bit of what that process might look like?
Sure. The way I think of it is that individuation is basically the project that the self is always working on. It's the life project of the human individual. And part of that project is the balancing of these kind of opposites that exist within us. So, you may have a very prominent aspect of your conscious mind or your persona as, somebody incredibly virtuous, somebody who is calm and, never triggers into anger. But then in the background, in your unconscious, you have an undeveloped aspect of yourself that may present itself as, a passive aggressive comment here and there, or may occasionally result in you just exploding for no reason and you don't understand how that bubbled up. It didn't feel like that's you because it's not your conscious mind, it's coming from the unconscious. And so there's these opposites that exist within us that need to be reconciled. That's one of the processes that are occurring in individuation. When one engages them, you're starting to reconcile these opposites. And then also, of course, there's your complexes that, I visualize as these knots. They're just these balls of tension that in some way influence you in your daily life often, and in the process of, your life and addressing and confronting these or just acknowledging them, you ease their tension and you bring them into the light of your consciousness, basically. So the process of individuation in its ultimate and idealized form would be you're bringing everything that is under that sea level iceberg into your conscious view. And then by the end of your life, it would be a wonderful thing if we all did. We saw all of those, myriad, that multitude of influence that we've had throughout our life.
Wow, and so much packed into those theories. And yes, absolutely, the resolving of psychological tension, or at least the bringing into awareness of psychological tension, is so important. When you're unaware that you're being pulled in different directions, say part of you is ambitious and wants to work hard, and yet another part of you feels incredibly constrained by that and longs for freedom. If that's a kind of tension that you're unaware of, it can define your life. It can rule you. It can cause you a lot of mental suffering, a lot of neurosis. And just becoming aware of these tensions, it's not everything, but becoming aware is such an important first step. So this idea of tension, I think both Freud and Jung really helped people to understand. Obviously, Jung, you could argue, on a somewhat deeper level. So having covered a little bit about how Jung thought about the mind, going back to dreams, because again, Freud and Jung differed about the approach to dreams. What was the Jungian approach to dreams?
So it's viewed in Jungian analysis that the dream life of an individual is where the unconscious basically communicates to your conscious mind. The division between them is now lowered, and your dreams are direct communications from what's existing and what these various motivations and what these influences are on you that exist in your unconscious. And at times those will bubble up from also what Jung termed the collective unconscious. But most often, especially the ones that feel very emotionally wrought and engaging, those are existing from what you have and what you carry in your personal unconscious. But the problem is, and why analysts exist, is that the dreams and the language of the unconscious, you could say, is through symbol and metaphor. And this is naturally very confusing, and it's resulted in people, throughout the centuries inventing, dream dictionaries. This symbol means that symbol and such, which is a little bit of a misguided effort. In Jungian theory, it's understood that although there are archetypes and they tend to have universal meanings, for each individual, those symbols can and often do take on personal significance. If I see a cat in a dream, if you see a cat in a dream, depending on our experience with cats in our lives, it means totally something different. And so I don't know if that answers part of your question, but those are my thoughts at the moment.
Yeah, and important to point out the distinction between the Jungian view and the Freudian view. So as you mentioned, dreams are a bit obscure and there's a symbolic language to dreams. And my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that, as you mentioned, Jung felt that dreams were symbolic because that was simply the language of the unconscious. You could also call it the right hemisphere of the brain if you wanted to. Like, the unconscious is communicating to us in the best way it knows how, and that's through symbols. And my understanding is Freud felt it was symbolic because there was an element of repression, like your mind was trying to guard itself against itself. And I think, both theories have validity, but certainly the idea that our unconscious is trying to communicate to us in the best way it knows how is compelling to me, particularly because sometimes dreams are very literal. Sometimes, at least in my experience, when I think about my own dreams, sometimes they're symbolic, but sometimes they're as clear as possible. So I don't necessarily buy the idea that there's that inbuilt repression. So important to point out. And then the other thing I would point out is that, particularly when I'm working with people clinically, it's very hard to interpret someone's dream unless you know what they're going through in their personal life. It's like essential. So I can give you an example of that. I knew someone who had a dream that they were putting their hand into a mixed bag of chocolates, and there were two possibilities. They're either going to get one chocolate or the other, and they didn't get the chocolate that they wanted, but rather strangely they kept pulling out their father's favorite chocolate and not theirs. And then that's hard to interpret, hard to know exactly what's going on until you find out about that person's personal life, and they'll tell you very plainly, I'm currently working with my father and feel like I'm doing all the kind of work that he likes to do and none of the kind of work that I like to do. And then all of a sudden the dream makes a lot of sense.
Sure, right. Yeah, and again, if one were to use a dream dictionary, it'd be like, chocolate means this. But it's like, well, no. We have all these, the relationship dynamics being involved as well, like what you're saying. Yeah, no, it's a tricky business interpreting a dream, but there's tremendous value in it because, again, it's communicating something that is outside of one's awareness. And the Jungian analyst and author Robert Johnson has an amazing book called Inner Work that is all about dream interpretation through the Jungian lens, and in a very, very practical way. It's brilliant. I'm reading through it the second time right now. There's just a lot he fills in a very short span.
And from Jung himself, what are the books that you might direct people to read first if they wanted to learn more about Jung? I know a lot of his works are quite dense and quite difficult to get through. Are there any in particular you would recommend?
Yeah, always Man and His Symbols is a great start. And this is a book that he wrote toward the end of his life, which was largely motivated by his colleagues, basically saying that, you have these theories of mind that could provide so much value to the common man and woman. But up until that point, his psychology was largely followed by clinicians. And that's partially why his work, when one tries to read it, is so academic and dense, because that was the intended audience. But this book, Man and His Symbols, was intended for more of a broad audience, and it includes various essays from Jung, but also from his colleagues like Marie-Louise von Franz and such, who, in a sense, Jung gave his stamp of approval to in these essays that they write for more of a broad audience. And then beyond that, a very approachable book also is what's his essentially his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, where Jung talks very candidly and openly about his own life and his dreams throughout his life that were meaningful to him, and visions and his experiences, initially writing the Red Book, which he only talks about in kind of these side references, because at the time the Red Book wasn't known publicly, but he refers to it in these very significant ways as an important experience. So those two.
Okay. I've read Man and His Search for Meaning, which I would also recommend. And particularly in that book, he's talking about how things have unfolded during the 20th century and how his concerns about how things might continue to unfold. If Jung were around today, how do you think he would view the way politics and culture have progressed? Do you think he'd be pleased at the direction that things have gone in? What do you think he'd make of it?
I think it's so hard to assume for Jung on certain opinions like this. I have so much respect for him. It would be it would be very haughty of me to try to assume that I can think like him. But I mean, certainly he would see these grand stories of the archetypes playing out on the world stage as they are today, through our politicians, through our wars, through these various conflicts that we continue to have. We essentially, as a human species, have the same problems that we had when Jung was still alive, and they've only become more exaggerated. So he would still have the same sense of impending doom and danger that he had toward the end of his life. The last few years, he had a few visions of a great apocalypse or a catastrophe. That he told this to Marie-Louise von Franz, and she's never shared the exact details of it in any written or video form. But she says that she had this paper. So that paper is somewhere of exactly what his vision was. But essentially, that the way I see it is humanity is always on the brink of self-destruction. And partially this is due to our inability to recognize these motivations, influences that exist in our unconscious, that propel individuals, nations, and communities towards certain ends that are sometimes self-destructive. And so that's partially, I think, my thoughts on it.
Yeah, and I guess he would have also commented, I suppose, on the fact that the gap of meaning that we have in our society and culture has just continued to grow. My understanding is that he talked a lot about the decline of religion as an important institution, and that religion was leaving a very important gap, and that gap was going to be filled by what he saw as more superficial manifestations of the culture, like, for example, our politics, as you mentioned. And that, as far as I can tell, since the 20th century, that problem has only gotten worse. And this is why I think there is such a resurgence of interest in things like ancient philosophy, which you see in a lot of long form content, a lot of podcasts, because I think on one level or another, we're becoming increasingly aware that a given society or given culture used to run on these long-standing existential pillars, and those pillars have been wiped away, and now it's like conservatives versus liberals on TikTok, and that's like not a substitute at all for the fundamental anchors of your society.
Right. No, a great point. I wish I would have thought of it myself, but I do have some thoughts on it. So in Jung's Red Book, he mentions these two influences that I suppose he implies exist in every individual. And this goes back to what you're saying, that there is the spirit of this time and the spirit of the depths. So what we could say is occurring in this scenario, where I agree, people who are otherwise raised without any formal religion, any formal spiritual practice that connects them to a native faith or to their own ancestry, which, yeah, it is, I think, a detriment to society. They're finding these other avenues. They're getting interested in ancient cultures. They're, reading Plato's dialogues and engaging with perhaps their own way into those cultures through whether it's witchcraft or anything else they find. And I think what they're responding to is the spirit of the depths, which Jung talks about at length in the Red Book. And it's a call from these more ancient parts of our mind, a call toward timeless things that can be revived, that have long since died. And in many ways that can connect us to the past and connect us to, ancestors and these kinds of influences. And while the spirit of this time is the most superficial layer of society that includes our politics, includes our celebrities and such, which with every generation essentially becomes wiped away and replaced. And when we fixate on that level too much, even though it may give some dopamine release and such in the moment, we find it very unsatisfactory in the long term, I think.
Yeah, and it's just not going to be something that sees you through the ups and downs of life. And that's something I see clinically. And funnily enough, I think the context in which I saw it the most was when I worked in an addiction clinic, where often you're seeing people who are either addicted to alcohol, heroin, very commonly, cocaine, and they're trying to figure out how to come off a drug like that. And the biggest mistake someone with an addiction like that often makes is they focus on how to come off the drug, but they don't focus on how do I build a life that would make it unsatisfactory to go back to drugs. And I think that's because as soon as you tackle that much harder, much deeper question, you are facing existential issues. What actually do I value about my life? What is there to value about life in general? And within this very medicalized way of viewing addiction, there almost isn't room to have those conversations. So I found myself having these more existential conversations with my patients there. And this is not in a psychotherapy context. This is more of a medical context where my role was more as their physician than as their therapist. And yet it felt that, the medical stuff obviously had to be taken care of, but once the medical stuff is taken care of, then it felt like it would have been a disservice to the patient to not take things on that more existential level.
Right. No, that makes total sense. And I'm sure that was appreciated by the people who you were speaking to in that regard. And maybe we can pivot for the moment to that. So in your experience, as a clinician, psychiatrist, are there moments where you see either this gap in modern psychology and the medical approach, and perhaps this way that Jung and the theories of Jung address these kinds of gaps?
Yes, so I think the gap is the same. The same gap he talked about, the meaning gap, if you like, and other prominent intellectuals have referred to it as the meaning crisis. I believe John Vervaeke, who is a academic psychologist in Canada, has talked about it as the meaning crisis. Other people have talked about it as a spiritual blackout. I think that very much exists within both medical psychiatry and academic and clinical psychology. Both of those disciplines have a lot of value to offer, but both of those disciplines are looking at the mind and as people, in my view, through too much of a mechanistic lens. The brain is a engine, or the brain is a computer. And something I learned from Ian McGilchrist, who's a psychiatrist who also studies and thinks about the brain, is that when you use a particular analogy to describe something, you're trapped within the limits of that analogy. So yes, in many ways the brain is computer-like, but by saying the brain is a computer, you're now trapped thinking about it within those bounds. And even though the brain is computer-like, the brain is also much more than a computer. So what I'm getting at is that I think these disciplines view human beings and the human mind in a too limited a capacity, and makes it too easy to cut off the need for things like spirituality, things like transcendent experiences, things like a need for deeper wisdom traditions. I think through a more mechanistic lens, those things I just mentioned are seen as decadent, or as a fantasy, as Freud may have thought of them, as a kind of aberration or anomaly or a mistake. And as a society, I can't help but see the constant psychological suffering that's produced from that. The suffering from not connecting to our deeper, like, pathos as a species, our deeper problems, the universal problems of being alive is something that's completely missed when you throw that stuff out of the way. So sorry, that was a long rant, but I hope I answered your question in some way.
That's fantastic. No, it's heartening to see, someone who works, in the medical field, who's concerned with those things, because, like you say, once the very clear medical issue is addressed, then there's these other things that come to the fore, which in some instances can be even psychosomatic, right? Someone's existential crisis can lead them to have a physical ailment or some issue, or maybe just even a drop in their immunity level and such. So there's the entire health of the individual at stake.
Yeah, definitely. And on that note, Jung talked about a particular existential crisis that people can go through, I believe, in the mid-30s, and he talked about that in the Red Book, I think.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about that? What are these, no coincidence I'm in my mid-30s, but what are the kind of crises that people of that age, hypothetically, I'm asking for a friend, might go through during that time?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of those moments when I was reading the Red Book my first time through, that it struck me like a bolt of lightning when I read that passage, when Jung presents this kind of scenario that occurs to people in around their 35th year. And I believe I read it around that age as well. And he termed it the shadow side, the descent into the shadow side of life, where someone, in his view during that writing, he says they begin to look for their soul, and they have this turning inward that occurs. And if they don't find it, which is very unsettling to read, from him to say, that if they do this turning inward during the shadow side of life, and they look for their soul and they don't find it, then they'll turn right back around to the external world, to the material world, and try to look for it there. And they'll turn around like a whip lashing them, but they'll never find their soul in the external world. And they'll go for this basically an indulgent kind of whiplash back into the material world that basically is a fruitless endeavor. But this idea is just such a compelling one, and it's important to note that Jung's visions that caused him to start writing the Red Book occurred to him in his late 30s as well, as he's nearing 40. So there's something to that, I think. And I think maybe it also has to do with this idea that by that point in life, let's say, your mid-30s, you're old enough to have experienced a few things that change you, that alter you. You've seen a few tragedies. Maybe you've lost a friend, you've lost a loved one, you've lost some family members, you've had a relationship or two go sour, and you've seen other people, mourn and lose things. And you start to take life a little more seriously. And you start to question, what else is there? What else is beyond life? Where do I find my meaning? What else do I want from life, from what's left of it? And I think that's part of it too. I think there's a real practical element there, and why perhaps that would occur at that point in time.
Yeah, I think in that period of life, we start to come to terms with, like you said, its limitations, its finitude, and then everything takes on a new level of seriousness. And I actually think that maybe it's for men a kind of mid-30s thing, but I actually think for women it happens a lot earlier. I think
could be, yeah.
For various reasons, the differences between the sexes, women have to contend with the fact that life is a very serious prospect a lot earlier. They mature younger,
right,
sexually, but also psychologically. But certainly at some point you have to come to terms with the dangers and the restrictions of life. And before that, you're kind of in this period of almost naive optimism,
right,
and going through that process where it's inevitable part of maturation. And I guess it brings home the idea that growth is not necessarily pleasant. Like growth can be filled with pain, as it was for Jung. So maybe you can tell us, what was happening to Jung when he was writing the Red Book.
Sure. Yeah, again, this is part of that thing that I was mentioning. It's one of the greatest stories of psychology. So the impetus to write the Red Book comes from Jung's split from Freud. And the reason being there is that he has an immense support network of colleagues and friends that are now tied to Freudian thought and that line of psychology. But as he splits from Freud, he also basically loses this social support network, and he becomes derided by these people that he used to call friends. And in the papers that he writes, they start to label him in what they termed a pejorative word, which was a mystic. They said, no, now who does he think he is? Some kind of mystic. And so he's now facing this crisis, a very personal and existential crisis in his life, where he still has his own personal practice, but he's basically, he's been pushed out of the nest in that regard. And during that upheaval, he, in October 1913, he's traveling on a train through the Swiss Alps, and he has what he terms a vision. And it's this apocalyptic vision of a great flood in which he sees the bodies of countless thousands, and then this river becomes blood. And he says that he cannot shake the vision, that it stays with him for quite a while. And then this recurs throughout the next few weeks as well, that specific type of vision, but also another one in the following year. And so he feels that there's something going on under the surface, and he would do a disservice to his clinical patients in therapy who may be going through similar things if he didn't try to understand what was happening with himself. And so part of that process is every evening, practically, according to his notes and his journal entries, he sits down, after everyone has probably gone to bed. He has his tobacco pipe and such, and he enters into a state of meditation where he then engages something that I've called the digging method. This is visualization that he uses, where he proceeds to take this fantasy and kind of turn it inward on itself and travel down into these imaginary depths. And in that process, he starts to interact with his unconscious contents. And these things he terms visions. We basically have no good word to approximate what it is he's doing, because it's such a foreign thing for us, as adults to do. But we'll term them visions. And so he writes them down and catalogs them initially into what are called the black books, which are just his personal journals about these experiences. And then he proceeds to take the next step and give them even more of this kind of value and reflection on them by writing them out in calligraphy in what's called the Red Book, which is this big leather-bound volume. And he writes them out by hand, and he even paints illustrations within there. So it ends up looking like this medieval illuminated manuscript when someone opens it. And it's quite large too. It's 12 inches wide by 15 inches long. And so that begins the process of the Red Book, which lasts a number of years that he works on it.
So if you look at the Red Book, it's got these amazing illustrations, and if you're interested, definitely look those up. They're like it's like a collection of paintings essentially, and I guess that's what's interested you as an artist.
Sure.
Is it fair to say the Red Book is an amazing work of art, independent of the psychological value?
Sure. I mean, I would say certainly it's a great work of literature in just its sheer uniqueness, and it's certainly a work of art, though Jung didn't see it as such. He never wanted to exhibit any of his paintings or anything like that. He shied away from presenting himself publicly as an artist. He saw this as a function of his own, in a sense, his own therapy, his own investigations of his unconscious, and that this process of externalizing these visions, these interactions with his unconscious, that they cemented certain insights and brought forth more the ability to process these changes that were happening in him. But yes, certainly most people see it, including myself, as a work of art and a great work of literature.
And something I'd like to go back to briefly is that, in 1913, he has this this apocalyptic vision of that, and it's not necessarily, a concrete prediction about what's going to happen, but it's this apocalyptic vision. And then the next year, World War I happens.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I'd like to emphasize this because I think often when we look at things that have happened in history, because they happened, there's a sense of inevitability, and we can ascribe a sense of intentionality to the important leaders in that time, that, World War I was a thing that happened, it was caused by this person and this person and that person. But something I'd like to point out about World War I, and I'm not a historian, but this is my understanding, is that no one really knew that was going to happen. People thought there would be some kind of conflict, maybe it would be a larger conflict than others, but no one knew it was going to be World War I, the most unprecedented conflict we've seen at that time. And part of the reason that happened is just the unpredictability of geopolitics, but also the technology that was available at that time, and particularly the invention of the machine gun. And it was, very much the combination of that, the geopolitical turmoil and the opening of the Pandora's box of technology, combined with no ethical overarching structure, no moral structure, no meaning structure, as Jung would have pointed out, to help us realize that, hey, things are going in a bad direction.
Right.
And if you combine A with B, we're going to get the apocalypse. So I thought that was worth emphasizing. And then not only did that happen, but then it happened again, like a few decades later.
Yeah, his history, it's called, what did they say? History doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The same scenarios, keep reoccurring, and we keep making the same mistakes, Hopefully we keep growing too. But what you mentioned is yes, it's an important side note there. And Jung recognized that as well, because from that first initial apocalyptic vision to then that vision recurring, and then another one taking its place in his dreams afterward, which was one of a great frost coming over the world. And in that vision of the great frost, where many lives were lost, and also vegetation, the ability to eat plants and such was lost. At the end of that vision, he sees himself as grabbing these sweet grapes from a tree and giving them out to people as a form of sustenance. So there's kind of almost like a resolution there, and that dream started to occur to him about a month before the war broke out. So he recognized that at first he assumed that those dreams were indications of the mental strife that was going on in his own unconscious. But then once, those events happened and World War I erupted, he started to consider, was that precognition? Was that some kind of influence from the collective unconscious coming up? I tend to believe personally, after having reflected on this many times, I think it was both. I think the mind has these interesting abilities to bring forth symbols and insights and such when there's a confluence of factors. In that instance, I think Jung, at the crossroads and such, at that instance, I think Jung was going through what would be called a mental breakdown. But at the same time, there were indications that the world was about to hit the same kind of point. And so the reason those dreams recur to him and then even shift, but still keep their apocalyptic feel to them, I think is because there's this confluence of both occurring.
Yes, and then that points to the different ways you could look at what a mental breakdown is. And again, going back to the way things are viewed typically clinically in a modern environment, a breakdown is bad. My car breaks down, that's a bad thing. But again, referring to what I said earlier, our minds aren't cars, our minds aren't machines. And importantly, the interesting thing about the human mind is breakdown certainly can be a bad thing, and a breakdown can take you out. And I have seen that happen. But a contained breakdown, a breakdown which can be managed, a breakdown that you recover from reasonably, that can actually take you forward, because it means that, and I'm using the word breakdown very generically. So, you might have a breakdown with psychotic symptoms or depression or parts of your personality changing, but let's just think about it generically. A breakdown that you can face, that you're somehow able to confront, that you're supported with, and that you can recover from, can actually get you to a higher level, which is very different from a machine. A machine cannot recover from a breakdown and actually get better. Human beings can, because the strange thing about human beings is you can have a breakdown. That means the paradigm through which you've been looking at the world dissolves, and you can enter a more sophisticated paradigm, a paradigm of greater depth, or a paradigm of greater maturity. And my understanding is this is something that Jung talked about quite a bit.
Right. I mean, I'm really interested in hearing, your thoughts and your experiences, either personal or professional, otherwise, in these kinds of scenarios. But I think that completely makes sense to me, the idea that a breakdown, if it's not, completely debilitating, is an opportunity as well to rebuild something stronger, to rebuild something that lasts longer, that perhaps one is now building based on the knowledge one gained from the tragedy perhaps that just occurred, or the misfortune that one faced. I think that's an important facet of life that we overlook or maybe don't acknowledge. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and it's definitely something I've seen clinically, and this is something that's actually well acknowledged in psychotherapy, that today's coping mechanism is tomorrow's crutch. Every coping mechanism, although it can be useful, has limitations. So like, even let's take the most basic coping mechanism, or the most basic defense mechanism, like repression. Freud talked about this. In the short term, if something really unpleasant happens, repressing it is a good idea because it means you don't have to deal with it. And isn't that a wonderful thing? But in the long term, if you repress something, and this is something Freud pointed out, it will come back in uglier ways or ways which are more damaging or more corrosive. But this isn't just true with like more unsophisticated coping mechanisms like repression. It's true for any way we cope with life. For some people, I think we're living in an era where lots of people cope with life with ambition. We live in a very ambitious, individualistic culture, and ambition is one of the ways we try and deal with some of the unpleasantness of life. We try and think, well, as long as I'm being all I can be and I'm optimizing my nutrition and optimizing my body and optimizing my bank account, everything's going to be great. And that's, for many reasons, that's a great coping mechanism, because it's a coping mechanism that means you can build a great life, but it can only guard you against some of the deeper sort of tragedies of life for so long before at some point, whether it's in your mid-30s or later, you have to confront them. So I think the meta coping skill is the ability to acknowledge and change your coping mechanisms regularly, to recognize when that's necessary, which is, what I'm saying is not an easy thing, and I'm no, master at it myself, but I think that's what the meta skill is the ability to realize when a coping mechanism has exhausted itself and maybe when we need to try something new. And I think to remain psychologically healthy, that is a lifelong process.
Right. It reminds me of a personal experience that it was along these lines. Now, a few years ago, one of my best friends died, and it was kind of sudden and unexpected. And he left behind his wife and his 7-year-old child, which we're still very close to and were close to at the time. But due to that experience, initially it's the upheaval of the first few months of grief, and it was surprisingly intense grief in my case, because I didn't realize how close our relationship had gotten over about 20 some odd years. It snuck up on me. And so his death was it brought up a lot of things for me. And so, I spoke with a grief counselor and such, and that was very, very helpful. But the reason I bring it up in this context was it was a type of breakdown of my framework of life. And I knew that it was a breakdown because I couldn't do art anymore while I was processing this grief, while I was experiencing, living through it. And so I understood that to be, okay, something is being rebuilt inside of me. And same thing was going on, with his wife, and obviously in many more intense ways. But in the aftermath of this, now that a few years have passed, I can say that because of that loss and because of that grief that I experienced, it's opened me up to be more emotional, and that's not a bad thing. It's opened me up to connect more with individuals, with people, and I think partially the reason is because I understand what's at stake now. I understand that when a family loses their father or their mother, and only one is left, and the child, and I see what effect that has, both personally because I experienced some of that grief, but also just in living close to that, by trying our best to take care of them in the aftermath. And so I know what's at stake, and so rather than closing me off, perhaps that would have happened if I would have brushed it aside and tried not to acknowledge the grief or just go on living. It's made me able to, I think, connect more emotionally with other people.
Yeah, that's a big insight. Like you see the limits of. There's something about understanding the limits of life help you see the value of life.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
How have some of Jung's ideas? You're a creative person, and it sounds like you create in so many domains. Music, podcasts, etc. How have Jung's ideas influenced you creatively as you go through the creative process?
Well, mainly it helps me understand the structure of it in terms of the potential influences of any given, work of art, music, or poetry. Occasionally an influence arises like while I'm about to fall asleep in this kind of hypnagogic state, and I see an image or a melody or something that captivates me, and I need to then, create it externally. And so Jung's framework helps me understand what's happening there. So I'm not misattributing things, but also I can help it along sometimes because I understand it a little more, I feel like. But other than that, in terms of like this idea of archetypes and such, I try not to influence those things superficially. Like somebody might try to write a script for a movie and they'll say like, let me lay out all the archetypes, and I know that this archetype works with that one, and then we have to make sure that they clash, and superficially influencing the structure. I think that can in the end result in a subpar work that doesn't feel true or organic. And so in that regard, I certainly don't try to like create a formula of like knowing that in the collective unconscious this is going to bubble up or whatever. I think the organic aspect of any work of art, any creative work, is the most valuable aspect of it, because you shouldn't really know where it comes from until it's already in front of you in that regard.
Yeah, that's interesting. So you're saying and I think most people intuitively try and create like this if they're new. If you put your conscious mind at the driver's seat, you're not going to generate anything truly creative. True creativity needs to come more from the unconscious, which is why accessing that hypnagogic state right before sleep or right after sleep, it gives you that gateway to things that not even you are aware of, letting that bubble up and letting that take the wheel in the creative process, if you like.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What's fascinating, I think, is that those influences that exist in the unconscious of, like, let's say, an artist, for this sake, the work that comes out from those influences can be personally meaningful, but also can serve a very specific, meaningful purpose in the culture that artist exists within. And so the work may come out, and to the artist, they don't always, oftentimes, understand what this work means, but they feel that it's meaningful, consequential, and important to produce. And then only after the fact, one realizes that, this is serving this greater purpose within the fabric of the culture they live within. And it becomes an important work for other people too, and not just personal work. So there's these influences that we don't understand or don't realize are propelling us towards certain directions, I think.
And I think it even applies to speaking and conversation and podcasting, because I'm not sure how scripted your podcasts are, for example, but because my podcasts are largely conversations, I might get asked, how do you generate a conversation that flows? And again, someone's intuitive approach might be, having all the perfect questions prepared from before, and how do you know exactly what you're going to say? And preparation is important, and having questions prepared is important, but generally speaking, in a conversation, you're going to want to let things bubble up to your mind, both questions but also comments and impromptu rants you might go on. You want to let those bubble up and go with them. And that being the case, speaking well, having a good conversation is less about sort of frantically trying to control every word that comes out of your mouth. It's not a control mechanism. It's more an allowing. Allow yourself to be open to different thoughts and feelings which occur to you, and then have the courage to express them with the full knowledge that maybe you'll say something dumb, but and you might, but you'll also say the best stuff. The best stuff will also come out during that process, I think.
Yeah. There's that spontaneity invites kind of deeper insights and things that you wouldn't have considered just through conscious kind of processing earlier on, when like you have to make the checklist of all the questions you have to make sure you've asked and such. I totally agree that a good conversation is more like a jazz performance rather than, this kind of mathematical checking of the to-do list. And in a jazz performance, as a musician myself, I can say that the jazz music. Very few jazz musicians do like pure improvisation. It's always you have your piece laid out in terms of your verse, chorus, verse, and such, and then what the melody is, but you leave room for yourself to improvise throughout in certain sections. There's a looseness to it, and that varies from performer to performer. But the core idea of it is that there's a structure within which you can improvise, basically.
Yeah, the beautiful dance scene structure and improvisation. And it even works for psychotherapy because spontaneity is the engine of psychotherapy. It's what makes it go. It's how people come to realize things about themselves which they weren't previously aware of. The most common thing people say in psychotherapy sessions is, I don't know where to start. And really the key is just start and keep going and see where it goes, and don't feel like, this is what I would tell to my clients, don't feel like it has to be correct or relevant, or don't feel like it has to make sense, grammatical or otherwise. Just let yourself speak and don't worry, it will go in a useful direction, and almost always it does if you let yourself do that. But then some clients, they can be too clamped down on that they have to say the correct thing, and then ironically that's stifling them, and it's counterproductive. So there's a lot of people who I think who aspire to be creative. Do you think we live in a good time to be creative?
It's tricky. It's a yes and no kind of answer. Overall, though, I think there's more yes on that spectrum than no, because the ability of the internet and our kind of leveling of the playing field of how as a creator you can engage a certain level of visibility that 20 years ago, would that be even before the internet, or is it now 30 years ago? Probably at least 30 years ago, before the internet.
It was 50 years ago.
50 years ago. So pre-internet time, there was very much a structure of industry gatekeepers for each industry that you're interested in participating in, whether it's film or music or even visual art. But the internet has leveled that playing field. At the same time, though, since the internet has been around as long as it has, those industries have figured out a way to have a foothold again. So, with music, if you're in the music industry, you're making songs and you put them on Spotify and such. Spotify now has deals with very specific record companies. And so the music that gets more likely pushed to new listeners is music that they already have a deal with the record company, that's paying them and such. So those industries, again, have a foothold. But overall, I think that, like even just your podcast, my podcast, the fact that we can publish something that then has the potential to reach an international base of listeners is overall a plus. And in that regard, it is a wonderful time to be a creative that is courageous enough to create consequential works.
What's courageous about creativity?
I mean, the fact alone of being able to externalize something that could potentially be derided, made fun of, that could potentially be a complete failure, takes courage. So there's the ability of your self-critique to be the danger. You create something and then you beat yourself up because you failed or you didn't achieve it the way you had envisioned it. So it takes courage against your future critiques. But then, of course, the more obvious one would be it takes courage to create anything that then enters the public eye or even the eye of a single audience member who it's directed toward, a loved one or, a romantic interest. Because again, you don't know what the reaction is going to be. And oftentimes, if it's a very meaningful piece to you, no matter what creative work it is, you're sharing a certain piece of your soul or your heart with other people. And So to me, every creative act is an act of courage.
Absolutely. And how did you deal with that? Was that a struggle with you, or were you just so engrossed in the creative process that you were going to do it regardless of what other people thought?
Right. I mean, early on, luckily, I recognized that I, as a teenager, gained a lot of satisfaction from the creative process, creating visual art, painting, drawing, writing songs. I realized that at one point, as I was, learning guitar, that I enjoyed creating songs more than playing other people's songs. So, there's people who go into Juilliard to be musicians and performers, and then there's people who go into Juilliard to be composers, who just the writing of the music. And so I realized early on that it just was such a love of mine. And so luckily my parents, had the wisdom to say, okay, well, if he's interested in art, maybe, let him go to an art high school, like an art-centric high school. So I went to the High School of Art and Design in Manhattan, here in New York City. And there I became enmeshed in, a community of other misfits who were also, the artists of their local communities. And after that, there's no way to drop creative effort and work after, those early kind of foundational experiences. So I think that's what I would say.
Yeah, I think just having those early reference experiences, the ability to put something out that's flawed or have it fail, or realize that is in some sense failure isn't real, in the sense that something can perform in less than you want it to, or somehow be inadequate, and yet you can still derive a lot of value from it, and it can help inform the next thing you make.
Right.
I think if you view things through the right lens, there's a lot of useful failure which we kind of ignore, and we kind of make failure into this monster. But actually failure is just part of getting better at any process, whether it's creative or otherwise. And it's good to see that you had kind of that early positive experience. I'm sure that's why you've been able to go on and create it at such high volume.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I look at failure as a mix between an exploration and a result. Because if you look at it as just a result, it's just, well, you do something and there's always a result, right? And if you do this, that's what happens. But otherwise, if you also look at it as an exploration, there's something to learn from explorations, an experiment or exploration. So there's something you can then carry forth. And oftentimes I could say that in most works of creative people, that I cover and such, and in my own life, those perceived failures do teach you a lot that you then build on to then create something really great. And without those initial explorations that may have resulted in failure, the eventual, really insightful creations wouldn't be possible.
Definitely. Creativity is a long game.
Right? Yeah, in many ways, yeah.
We're out of time, but MJ, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. Where can people go to find out more about your work?
Sure. There's, I would say, two main places. There's my podcast, Creative Codex. That's CODEX. And that's available on Spotify and every podcast platform. And then there's just mainly for social media, I exist on my Instagram, which is at my name, MJDorian, one word with no spaces. And yeah, those two.
Perfect. MJDorian, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. It's been a pleasure.